So look at Anthony Ryder from South Lyon, Michigan, recently selected as the Lions 2020 Fan of the Year. He has a passion about sports broadcasting.
With the 112th selection in the 2021 NFL Draft, the Detroit Lions select Amon-Ra St. Brown, wide receiver, USC. One pride, baby! Yeah!
Throughout the NFL draft, the Detroit Lions had a lot of positions that people thought could be addressed relatively early. Obviously, you had the defensive line, you had the offensive line, you had the wide receivers and the cornerbacks, but an under the radar kind of position for the Detroit Lions this offseason was the safety position. After losing Tracy Walker, after losing CJ Gardner-Johnson, and potentially having Brian Branch make the full-time transition to slot cornerback, the Lions safety room was a little bit thin going into the NFL draft, with Ifeatu Melifonwu and Kirby Joseph being stars, but after that, kind of taking a dip in talent to last year's undrafted free agent in Brandon Joseph, and then that kind of being it. Now, over the last couple of days, the Detroit Lions have, of course, signed CJ Moore to be a depth safety and a special teams contributor, but another player that I don't see many people talking about as a potential roster snub is Maurice Norris, the 2-year starting safety at Fresno State from the 2 seasons prior. Now, Maurice Norris stands at 5'10", 181 pounds. With a 5.31 RAS score, Maurice Norris is not a phenomenal athlete, but he does have some underrated qualities to his game that I think could translate really well to the NFL. Now, taking a look at his athletic testing, Maurice Norris in the big stuff measured out pretty good, but nothing incredible. A 38-inch vertical, a 10'4" broad jump, a 4.53 40-yard dash, a 4.18 shuttle, and a 6.96 three-cone drill put Maurice Norris in a slightly above average free safety athlete, but nothing phenomenal and nothing really to write home about, which is part of the reason he went undrafted, right? He is small and he is a good, not great athlete with 4.5 speed. That's really not the type of player that you are going to draft highly in the NFL draft, but I do think he became a pretty high priority UDFA from Fresno State based off of the production he had in his final 2 seasons. Now, in 2022, Maurice Norris played in 14 games for the Fresno State Bulldogs, where he had 57 tackles as a free safety, 8 tackles for loss, 1 sack, 6 passes defended, and 1 forced fumble. He was a force in the running game. He was a great blitzer. He was great at getting to the quarterback, great at making explosive plays in the backfield. And overall, I think he fits much better as a box safety, but in his second year, he showed a lot of flashes at the deep safety position as well. Now, Maurice Norris, from everything that I've seen from the highlights and the little bit of tape that I was able to watch after finding out about him, he played more of a slot cornerback position, meaning he played a similar position to what Brian Branch plays with the Detroit Lions, matching up versus safeties, matching up versus tight ends, matching up versus running backs, and kind of taking away that inside option for opposing offenses. Now, based off of that, I do think that kind of leaves the door open a little bit for Maurice Norris to make the roster over a couple of other guys, just because the depth at slot cornerback is a little bit weak, right? You have obviously Brian Branch, one of the best nickel cornerbacks in the game, but after that, you really don't have very much. Will Harris left in the offseason, CJ Gardner-Johnson left in the offseason, and now there is a hole at both safety and slot cornerback, and I think Maurice Norris can be the Brian Branch light. He can be the backup. He can be the guy that plays a similar game to Brian Branch, but isn't necessarily as good as Brian Branch, right? He is kind of the carbon copy, the Brian Branch light, to say it lightly, and I think that he can play that role really well. And with the absence of the nickel cornerback position behind Brian Branch, I think there is a slot for Maurice Norris to make this roster. Now, in 2023, Maurice Norris took a sizable step up at Fresno State, having 59 tackles, 2 more than the season prior, having 9.5 tackles for loss, 3.5 sacks, 2 interceptions, 10 passes defended, as well as a forced fumble. He improved statistically at just about every single part of his game. His coverage improved. Obviously, 10 interceptions, or 2 interceptions, 2 more than the season prior, and 10 passes defended, 4 more than 2022. He had another forced fumble. He had more sacks, more tackles for loss, and more tackles, and was really a big-time threat on that Fresno State defense. Now, again, I think that Maurice Norris can play the slot really well. I think this is a guy that is going to be an upgrade over Will Harris last year. He's going to be an upgrade over the backup slot we had a season ago. And even though I don't think he's going to play very much, I don't think he is going to play over Brian Branch, obviously. I don't think he is going to play at the safety position very often, but I do think this is a player that is very much in the realm of, hey, if Brian Branch gets hurt, if he has to miss a couple of games, Maurice Norris plays a very similar style of game, is very similarly impactful at the college level a season ago, and can play that box safety, can play that slot cornerback, and not have you miss too many beats on the defensive side of the ball if you do have to miss out on Brian Branch for a couple of weeks. Meaning, his career totals were 17 and a half tackles for loss in 2 years, 4.5 sacks, 2 interceptions, 16 passes defended, and 2 forced fumbles. Now, I know I sound like a broken record at this point, but he is a very similar player to Brian Branch, a quick player that's not necessarily fast, but is quick in short areas. He is a great blitzer. He is great right at the line of scrimmage. He is great when being physical with wide receivers, and he has good quickness. He breaks on the ball really quick. He is really good at getting his hands on the football, and in man coverage, he is extremely sticky and makes a lot of plays. He's a big hitter. Despite being 5'10", 180 pounds, this kid will tackle. He will hit. He is not afraid to put his body on the line. He is not afraid to throw his body at offensive players, and he makes some of the biggest hits look routine. He makes some of the biggest plays when you don't expect him to be there, right? He is great at breaking on running backs. He is great at breaking on tight ends. He is great at working on smaller wide receivers, and I think that is where his value is going to be in the NFL. Versus smaller, quicker wide receivers, that's where you want Brian Branch, and that's where you want Maurice Norris. He is scrappy with the ball in the air. He is physical. His instincts are incredibly strong, and I do think this is a player that will make the roster for the Detroit Lions, or very potentially will be a preseason standout and potentially have the opportunity to make the roster, right? We talk about a lot of these other undrafted rookie free agents, right? We've talked about Isaiah Williams and his role with the Detroit Lions, but he still has to beat out 5 or 6 wide receivers to make the Detroit Lions roster, and 5 or 6 NFL veterans that can do so. We talk about the offensive line depth, but there is already 8, 9, 10 players on that offensive line before you talk about Kingsley Eguakong, before you talk about Duke Clemens, before you talk about even the rookies that were drafted, right? There's 8, 9 guys on the interior that are fighting for a roster spot that are NFL veterans. We talk about Steel Chambers a couple days ago, but he's going to be at best linebacker 6 in this rotation. Maurice Norris really doesn't have that much competition at the slot cornerback role, right? It's Brian Branch, and that's it. CJ Gardner-Johnson's gone. Will Harris is gone. And yeah, while Teron Arnold can play that role, while, Ennis Rakestraw can play that role, while Khalil Dorsey could play that role, that's not where they were drafted to be. They were drafted to be boundary guys. And with Cam Sutton officially no longer on the roster and the cornerback room looking very good for the outside, but a little thin for the interior, he's going to be battling with Amik Robertson for that slot role. But whereas Amik Robertson is kind of a more outside cornerback last year for the Raiders and didn't really play that well in the slot, I think Maurice Norris brings some versatility, brings a very similar identity to what Brian Branch had. And I wouldn't be surprised if Norris was a preseason standout. I wouldn't be surprised if he was a camp standout. And I wouldn't be surprised if this is a player that the Lions really want to keep around for the long term as a depth option. Now, with that being said, that is really all I have on Maurice Norris right now. Again, kind of a very similar player to Brian Branch from a play style, similar 40s, similar techniques, similar looks on the football field, basically. And I think that he is a very underrated prospect in this undrafted free agency class. And I think he'll be a really interesting player to find out and watch in the 2024 preseason. With all of that being said, that is all I have for you guys today. Let me know down in the comments below how you feel about Maurice Norris, how you think that potentially he might make the roster, whether it might not make the roster, whether he's a practice squad guy, an active roster. Let me know down in the comments below what you think about this player at this position. Be very curious what you guys have to say and what you guys think. But with all of that being said, that's all I got for you guys right now. Thank you all so much for watching, and until next time, and as always, go Lions.